Шановні учасники та учасниці сьогоднішнього
Hello,
вебінару.
dear participants of today's webinar. We are very glad to meet you today in these hard times. We are grateful that you have found the opportunity to join us today to the webinar that is dedicated to the recently approved recommendations on the human rights protection on the example of Japan. This webinar is possible due to support of the United Nations program in Ukraine. And basis on the principles of United Nations, it is possible also due to the support of the Japanese government, and it is part of the global project, which is carried out in Ukraine, Japan, and 16 other countries of the world. Today's webinar is dedicated to the Japanese market and to the recommendation that exists in Japan concerning human rights during activities, contraction
для виходу на
with
японський
Japanese
ринок. І
companies.
тому цей вебінар він може бути цікавий українським компаніям, експортерам, які або розглядають ринок Японії для своєї роботи, або вже працюють, або наразі
For
співпрацюють.
those who either work already with Japanese companies, have partnerships or suppliers to them, and for general understanding, it would be interesting to learn this information. Today's webinar happens also in partnership with the Commercial Chamber of Ukraine, because the Commercial Chamber of Ukraine does a lot to Ukrainian businesses to support it. That is why this partnership is very valuable to us. For the participants who have joined us in Zoom, I would like to inform you on several questions. We have translation available. If you want to stay in the Ukrainian channel, please choose Ukrainian in Zoom. Then you will have the opportunity to listen to the webinar in Ukrainian. For the participants who would like to listen in English, there is also the option to choose the English language and to listen to us in English. We have also live broadcast to Facebook and YouTube. So I encourage the participants, if you have questions, please write them under the broadcast or here in Zoom chat, and we will answer your questions. Our wonderful speakers will be addressed with these questions if they arise. So today's wonderful speakers will say more about the webinar issues, what Ukrainian exporters need to expect from the recent recommendations that have been approved, which changes are needed, and the experts will also provide more detailed context, what is important for the companies, especially who want to work in international or foreign markets. I would like to start today by inviting Ms. Hanna Lubyna, who is the representative of the Industry and Commerce Chamber of Ukraine. Please, you're welcome to say a few welcoming words and maybe tell your opinion about the topic of the webinar. Good afternoon, dear participants, dear organizers of this wonderful event. First of all, I would like to thank you that you're attracting attention to such important questions. And in the name of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce Chamber of Ukraine and its president, we would like to express our gratitude and inform that like 60% of Ukrainian businesses, the Chamber of Commerce continues its activity and development of Ukrainian export. It is a pity, but we have to admit that even though the trade with Japan before the war was stable and increasing. The war, the blockage of Ukrainian ports, transformation of world and Ukrainian economy have complicated this process. And the priorities of cooperation should be reconsidered. We are grateful that the international projects and that the government of Japan pays attention to Ukraine and informs on such important processes like human rights due diligence, which is the topic of today's webinar. And Japan shows its support to Ukrainians, and our goods that have been present in Japanese market will be available in duty-free networks. We have talked about this with the ambassador of Japan to Ukraine and representatives of big Japanese companies. We also continue our cooperation with our representation office in Japan. Our permanent representative, Mr. Konstantin Pletkov, is available there, who is consulting Ukrainian companies entering the Japanese market. We have broad partnership base with Japanese partnership organizations, including the Chamber of Industry and Commerce of Japan and other organizations. Ukraine and Japan have high perspectives for development of bilateral collaboration in sense of increasing the trade, investment present of Japanese businesses in Ukraine, and common interaction and cooperation in global events. From experience with our Ukrainian companies and our entrepreneurs, they cannot very quite imagine the specificity of the work in the country and the peculiarities of the business relationships, how you should represent yourself, how you should behave, and so on. Such events are very important for Ukrainian companies. To do so, last year, we have prepared last year for the work, a manual for the work on Japanese market, which was provided to Ukrainian exporting companies. Thank you, Ms. Anna, for your presentation. It was very interesting cooperation of the Industry and Commerce Chamber with Japan, and this valuable information for our participants concerning leading business in Japan, cooperating with Japanese stakeholders. I'm very grateful to you, and I hope that we will have a lot of tight and fruitful work in this direction. I would like to start the program of our webinar. The agenda that has been explained, that are the human rights due diligence recommendations in the supply chains of Japan. I would like to invite to take the floor Mr. Daisuke Takahashi, who is an expert lawyer in human rights and business law in Japan, who is a partner of Shinwa Law Company. He's joining us from Tokyo. It is 11 p.m. in Tokyo now. That's why we are very glad that you found the time and opportunity to join us that late. So please, the floor is yours. Please just say what are the most important aspects Ukrainian companies who want to work on Japanese markets need to know concerning these recommendations. What do they foresee and stipulate, and which influence will they have on our exporting companies? I would be very grateful if you can touch these questions in your speech. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for introduction, and also thank you very much for organizing and attending this event during this very difficult time. And thank you very much for inviting me to this also event. So let me also upload my slide and to overview the this topic, especially the guideline on the respecting human rights in responsible supply chain. This guideline was published by Japanese government this September. Yeah, let me overview. And then, but first of all, let me introduce myself briefly. I'm now speaking in this webinar as a capacity of a partner of the Shinwa Law Tokyo, and also officer of the Business and Human Rights Lawyers Network Japan. As a legal practitioner in Japan, I try to focus on the practical aspect, especially how like this guideline like impact on the Ukraine business and companies. And also like I would like to share with you, I have been engaged with the various business human rights related activity. I'm going to serve as a co-chair of the Business and Human Rights Committee of the International Bar Association, and also as a vice chair of the Corporate Social Responsibility Project team of the Japan Federation Bar Association. I have been participating the the implementation and also formation process of the National Action Plan on the Business and Human Rights. And of course, and also like in the private practice, I have been supporting Japanese and other multinational companies on their international business transaction and also global legal compliances. So in order to explain this Japanese like human rights due diligence guideline, like this guideline is like this guideline is based on the international norm called the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. Let me briefly explain what is like UNGP and what is expectation of the UNGP for the business enterprises. So UNGP, UN Guiding Principle on the Business and Human Rights, was endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council 2011, more than 10 years ago. And then this kind of international norm recognized corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And this UNGP states that business should implement the human rights due diligence, I'll say from now like HRDD, to assess and address the adverse impact of a business activity on the stakeholders' human rights. And what makes the UNGP significant as a business norm for the business enterprises is that the UNGP encourages business to address adverse impact not only through their own business operation, but also through their supply chains and also other business relationships. So triggered by the UNGP, regulation to mandate human rights due diligence through supply chain have been introduced in the Europe and the US, like several countries. So the regulation includes the UK Modern Slavery Act, French Vigilance Law, German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, and also the European Commission also recently proposed a draft of the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive this February. And also US Custom Act and Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, this US Custom Act prohibit importation of the goods which are made through the forced labor. And also US Global Magnitsky Act, which addressing also includes a sanction for the individual and the entity which those who are engaged with serious human rights abuses. So these supply chain human rights due diligence regulation is from like the EU and also US, but they have the extraterritorial impact also on the Eurasian, including both Japanese and Ukrainian business through supply chains and investment chain. Even if the regulation do not directly apply, company may be required by their client and partners to comply with the regulation. Please see the slide, the pictures on this slide. European and US human rights regulation mandates company, mainly European and US company, to comply the regulation, but not only through their own business operation, but also through supply chain. As a result, European and US business require suppliers and partners to comply the regulation. In this sense, like your Eurasian business also like kind of have a also impacted by this like regulation. In this context, also like Japanese government published a guideline on respecting human rights in response to supply chain, HRDD guideline, this September. The Japanese guideline aims to be based on the international standards such as UNGP, which I explained now. And also the guideline aims to explain HRDD in a concrete and easy to understand manner, which is tailored to the actual situation in Japan. And then this guideline apply, important things is this guideline apply to the all business engaging in business activity in Japan, including the Ukrainian business investing in Japan. And the structure of Japanese human rights due diligence guideline is mostly in line with the principles of corporate responsibility to respect human rights under the UNGP. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 is talk about introduction and the general summary. And then Chapter 3 is talking about human rights policy. And Chapter 4 is talking about human rights due diligence. This human rights due diligence is divided into the 4 steps. First step is identification and assessment of adverse human rights impact. And the second step is prevention and mitigation of adverse human rights impact. And third step is tracking activity effectiveness. And fourth step is communication and information disclosure. And then Chapter 5 is talking about providing the remedy. If there is any actual kind of impact to the stakeholder human rights, a company should address, provide or cooperate with access to remedy. So those steps of the respecting human rights is mostly in line with the UNGP principles. But what is especially unique, kind of characteristic of the Japanese guidelines that Japanese guidelines emphasize the importance of the collaboration and engagement with supplier in respecting human rights. Especially Section 2.2 highlights 5 key points on the respect of human rights. And the matter of time, I especially focus on the 5th point, which says that it is important that each business enterprise cooperate together each other in respecting human rights. It is important for the business enterprise not to delegate all effort to respect human rights to their business supplier, but to engage in activity to respect human rights together. So, so supplier and buyer, what is important for the both supplier and buyer to work together for the respect to human rights. Although these Japanese guidelines are not legally binding, but guidelines together with other rules promotes Japanese company to conduct human rights due diligence through supply chain. One driving force is public procurement rule, Tokyo 2020 Olympic Sustainable Sourcing Code, or Osaka 2025 Expo Sustainable Sourcing Code. Those code require their supplier to comply their human rights standards through supply chain, and those codes explicitly states supplier should refer to the human rights due diligence under the UNGP. And also this September, Japanese government announced they will consider how to incorporate the human rights due diligence into the Japanese public procurement rules. And also another direct driving force is sustainability disclosure rule, corporate governance code for the listed company in the Tokyo Stock Exchange states that board of directors of those listed companies should address a sustainability issue, including the respect of human rights. And also for the from the next year, listed company will be required to disclose sustainability information in their financial reporting. So, and also in addition, many Japanese companies recently started to join the collective grievance mechanism called the JSA, which accepts the stakeholder complaint on the human rights abuses through the global supply chain. And so, yes. So this is kind of the overview of the Japanese guideline and also the related to rule. And then to conclude my my presentation, I would like to give 3 action Ukrainian company can take for doing business in and also with Japan. First one is action is that strengthen your effort to respect human rights based on the UNGP. This kind of effort will also create a business opportunity by strengthening the trust relationship with Japanese business. And second action is deepen your collaboration and engagement with Japanese partner in respecting human rights. The Japanese guideline, as well as UNGP, emphasizes collaboration and engagement through supply chain. And the last point is share with Japanese partner your knowledge, your local knowledge and experience on how the Japanese company can respect and support human rights of Ukrainian people through their the business relationship with their company. In addition to addressing negative impact, promoting a positive impact on human rights is also important from the perspective of the implementation of the UNGP and also Sustainable Development Goal, which like many Japanese companies is committed to the contribute. So like this is my like kind of my presentation. Sorry, like talking like a little bit long. And if you have any question, please feel free to ask like any question. Thank you very much.
Дуже дякуємо Такахаші Дайсуке за вашу
Thank you, Takahashi Daisuke, for your presentation, that you have made an overview for us so broadly, not only from the requirements that are foreseen by the recommendations, by the guidelines, but also you have mentioned the much broader context, including the public procurement policies and the legislation on all of these. That was very interesting overview for all of us. Colleagues, if you have any questions concerning what Takahashi has said, please write to our chat or under the link to our broadcast. And we will be grateful if you write them. We will be answering them with pleasure. I can see that there are no questions for now. I believe that the topic is rather new and interesting, and it allows us to have a broader look on business processes, on economic processes from a different point of view, and start asking the question to ourselves: who are my suppliers? How do they respect their employees, customers and partners? How I, as representative of a company or owner of a company, can increase my competition ability, staying true to the respect of human rights. I think that after the webinar, we will gather some questions if they arise during it. And if we have some, then everyone who has registered can obtain short answers. Thank you very much for your presentation, that you have dedicated your time and effort to participate in this webinar. Thanks a lot. And for now, I would like to invite our experts, national experts of the due diligence human rights project in our country, supported and implemented with the support of the Japanese government in Ukraine, Olena Uvalova and Malina Saplikina, who will provide answers on what can be done in general to correspond to the principles mentioned today, and how this idea has arisen, how these United Nations guiding principles can be implemented into operational activity and daily activity of your company. I would like to invite Olena Uvalova to take the floor. She is Doctor of Science, lecturer and teacher of the Wageningen University, head of the Business and Human Rights Department of the Yaroslav Muda University, one of the founders of the concept of business and human rights in Ukraine. So, Olena, I give you the word. Thank you. Thank you. I'm also grateful for the organizer of this webinar, to those who have joined us today. And indeed, we would like to begin with underlining that the demand today in business and human rights and supply chains is a global trend. And in the slide, you can see now, in a random way, the chosen, selected screenshots from websites of different companies, including Japanese companies. And it is a must-have for these companies and those companies that position themselves as responsible businesses, understanding that this aspect of their activity is paid attention to by investors, partners, customers, including governments, and on their websites, corresponding policies can be found, and more attention in these policies, and the corresponding procedure is paid to the companies that belong to the supply chain of these companies. We have heard today that Japanese business is also called upon by the Japanese government to pay attention to the fact who belongs to their supply chains and who are their partners. In particular, I would like to share with you, we will send you into the chat later and share it with all the participants, but that you just try to pass a questionnaire where the following questions were. Does your company have a human rights policy? Does the human rights policy of your company include the norms of the internationally recognized standards in the human rights, including the United Nations, International Business and Human Rights Standards of UN, and so on? Does your company conduct training for suppliers and employees on human rights? Do you demand from your business partners, including your suppliers, to adhere to your policy in the human rights? Do you pay attention and effort that your suppliers know and adhere to policy in the human rights sphere, and so on? Which actions do you take to make sure that your suppliers adhere to these norms of human rights? And it is only a short part of the questions that have been asked in this questionnaire. I want to open my cards and to say what kind of questionnaire this is. It is a much detailed, much bigger one. And maybe that is only some 20% of the questions that are mentioned in this questionnaire. A big part of it is dedicated to suppliers in your supply chains of Japanese companies. And this questionnaire, the survey, has been conducted by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan exactly 1 year ago. And this questionnaire has been sent to almost 3,000 Japanese companies. Not all of them have answered and filled it in, but a big share of the companies has. And based on these answers, they were generalized, and an overview of the background of the situation, what is happening with the policies in the human rights sphere, in the supply chains of Japanese companies, is happening. The management that has been mentioned, this guiding principle that has been mentioned by our Japanese colleague, is actually a product that resulted from the answers to this questionnaire, because the biggest gaps have been detected, and as a response, the recommendations have been developed. Additionally, similar questions and indicators that companies can use for orientation are used not only like in the example of the Japanese government that the companies were surveyed, but these similar approaches used by the human rights benchmarker and investors. That is, World Benchmarking is a big survey led every year. And it describes the global trends and the branching and industry trends about how businesses introduce and adhere to human rights policies in their activity. This year, separate attention has been paid to Japanese companies. In particular, as far as in the end of November, the results for 2022 have been published, and particular attention has been drawn to the fact that the Japanese government has approved this recommendation for businesses on human rights in their supply chain adherence. If we have the translation of the human rights corporate benchmark in Ukrainian, if you're interested, you can see that the questions are very close, and the logic of these questions is also very close to the logic used by the Japanese government in its recommendation, and which the Ministry of Economics of Japan used. If you have the policies, do the policies correspond to the internationally approved standards in human rights and the standards of the International Work Organization, Labor Organization, or do you pay attention to the human rights observance in the supply chains? Do you work only with the first level of your supply chain or with the second and third and correspondingly further? All this logic is kept. Where does this logic come from? This slide I have borrowed, I must say, from a presentation made by Anita Ramesastry, who at that time was member of the Working Group of United Nations for Business and Human Rights. And when she explained to her auditorium why it is so important to pay attention to the supply chain and why the concept of businesses and human rights develops around not only own responsibility of the companies for observance of human rights, but what is done by the company in order that their supply chains also correspond to the principles. Because when we and the customers see a particular good, like chocolate or an apple, responsible partners and customers and responsible societies have a question not only about who manufactured this chocolate or who supplied these apples or any other product, but how they were produced, what is happening in the chain. And we all know that the manufacturers of chocolate and not only where the harvest of cocoa beans is included, their supply chains very often were disclosed as once using child labor, forced labor, labor in non-corresponding conditions, undue, and taking into account the questions that arise about the reputation of these companies, their placement in the market, and the possibility for these companies to pretend for investment. These companies started thinking about more and more about what is happening in their supply chains. And that is a very hard question, because it is clear that the supply chains cannot always be followed, especially if they are branched a lot. This is always a very hard issue for the company. For Ukrainian companies who belong to the supply chains of Japanese businesses, what we are talking actually about today, it is important to be knowledgeable of this tendency, of this trend. And what is more, big Japanese companies
свою відданість правам людини.
declare more and more their adherence to human rights. The human rights policies become more substantial. They introduce more due diligence procedures in the topic of human rights. And by the way, Japanese businesses very often are known as good practices in the human rights sphere. I mean, separate Japanese companies, because they have very concrete action plans on implementation of guiding principles on human rights, responsible business activity, etc. So they are prescribed for years how in their supply chains it will be implemented, the respect to human rights, and which concrete actions will be taken to do so. That is why Japanese companies, I would like to repeat that not all of them, but there are examples of Japanese companies and not every market can find such examples, that they do not just declare their beliefs or write off documents, but they prescribe particular deadlines, responsible departments who will be worked with, how the priorities are set, why some particular questions belong to their priority for the next 2 years, how the priorities are set among their suppliers, why the human right communication starts with corresponding suppliers if they have a very broad branch of these suppliers and not with the others. So this all is explained, and that these are positive examples. If for today's audience we make an introduction to the topic to explain why do we have today such a powerful trend that is increasing concerning the businesses and human rights, some of my colleagues on international level, they start with the question of the businesses and human rights with the Ost-India Company, even though most say that it is needed to begin with the General Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it has provided us with the principles of the modern day human rights protection principles and mechanisms, and the Universal Declaration that has been approved on 10th of December 1948. So 5 days ago, we have marked another anniversary of this document. So the preamble, the introduction to the Universal Declaration has said that every body of the public, of the society, so not only the state, we do not speak only about the role of states and governments in the human rights protection mechanisms, but every part of the society, which means also businesses, in the adherence to human rights. It is also important to mention the peculiarity that correlates with today's realia, that the Nuremberg process, as a result of the Second World War, also at the General Declaration of Human Rights, it happened not only over the political figures and actors, but also upon economic actors. And the question of corresponding behavior of businesses was also said that it is impossible, the business was unable to understand that they are not neutral during the war. When, for example, they have supplied gas to the Nazi government, everyone could understand for which reasons this gas has happened. We are speaking about energy sources in the modern society too. And the second part of the 20th century has more and more attracted attention to the fact that not only governments and states are responsible for human rights adherence, but also businesses who are responsible, and it really depends a lot not only on the possibility of the state, but also on the power of the business model that the particular company has selected. And more attention has been attracted to the fact that the mechanism of the human rights protection created after the Second World War, in the center of which was the governmental responsibility for the human rights, it hasn't worked as intended. That is why the understanding has been formed about the importance of supply chains, because
Компанії, що ми бачимо і сьогодні, що компанії,
What
які
we can see even today that companies registered
в країнах з сталими демократичними
with
традиціями, там, сильним
long-lasting democratic traditions, with
всьому світі,
strong legislational systems, can have supply chains around the world and not always transfer the same human rights standards to the parts of the world where their supply chains come from or where their subsidiaries work, that not the same standards are used in their home countries. Many particular cases have led the expert community, the international business and law protecting community, to the understanding of the need of elaborating standards for human rights standards for business. You can see in the picture John Rye, who is a special representative of United Nations Business and Human Rights. With his name, the Global Agreement of United Nations is associated very often. The companies that are members of the Global Agreement, they may be also interested in understanding that Kofi Annan, when he had his speech in 1999 about the need of collaboration between states and businesses and creating a partnership with the Global Agreement has become, his assistant was John Rye. John Rye has understood later that not only the partnership only is not enough, and he has supported a separate document which has been developed to the guiding principles on business and human rights. And as this document has been mentioned today, because it is the guiding document for the principles of businesses and human rights, it is based on three pillars: protection, that the states are obliged to protect humans from and their rights from the third parties, including businesses, that businesses have to respect human rights, and respect on the side of business means that they have to guarantee adherence to human rights in their activity, and that the businesses have to do everything depending on them, that no negative impact on human rights in their supply chains take place, as well as protection means if human rights of an employee or community member or supplier or representative of the supplier are adversely impacted, there should be access to protection means guaranteed. the guideline that we are talking about fully corresponds and copies the logic of the guiding principles of United Nations on business and human rights. And as you have heard, it says that companies should have policies in human rights sphere that shall be approved at the highest level of the company management to show the devotion of the company and its obligations to human rights, that on the level of the company, a mechanism of implementation of this policy shall exist. It cannot be just a document that has been adopted, but it has to be a throughout document, comprehensive document, and structural parts of the companies should understand their role and their own indicators to pay attention to when they are going through procurement processes, analysis of documents, hiring people, laying off personnel, etc. So including all actions of the company and all structural units of the companies need to have understanding of the human rights and the possible impact on human rights by the particular company. The mechanism of evaluation of the due diligence and the logic that is also included into the guiding principles is repeated in the recommendation of the Japanese government, that the potential and real impact shall be measured, that actions should be aimed in order to prevent and minimize the adverse impact, that the results shall be addressed, that communication about the efforts of the company should be communicated. So what company has done in order to prevent the negative impact. And on all these stages, it is important that the stakeholders are included, so the bearers of the rights, that their voices are heard. It is also important to say about the guiding principles that they are based on internationally acknowledged human rights. They are used upon all business entities and independently from their size, territory of activity, form of ownership, etc. And they do not create new obligations in human rights. So the principles, the guidelines of the Japanese government, they do not create new obligations for businesses, but they only speak about mechanisms which could be used in order that the existing and internationally recognized human rights could be observed. The guiding principles is a very, very authoritative frame, even though they are not legally binding, but they are actively used by the United Nations agencies and committees, the European Union, the Organization of Collaboration in Business, the World Bank, and many others, and they really correlate a lot with the principles. We have translated them in collaboration with the Ministry of Justice of Ukraine, so they are accessible in Ukrainian for the participants. We can send them to you. Attention has been paid additionally that the United Nations guiding principles have introduced the notion of due diligence, human rights due diligence in English, and which is interesting that from the history of that document, when John Ruggie has been working on it, he has introduced the term human rights due diligence. There were people who were skeptic about the usage of the term due diligence, because due diligence has been known for businesses for a long time, but the usage of due diligence as we use it normally is more the evaluation of risks for the company, especially the finance risks for the company. Human rights due diligence is something different, where the risks are assessed, but these risks are created by the company to the human rights. Even John Ruggie people tried to convince him not to use the due diligence term in order not to cause some kind of misunderstanding, but as of now, this term is common and recognized for those who work in human rights and businesses. But you have to understand that human rights due diligence is not for the risks for the business. It's about the risk created by the business towards human rights.
Можуть виникати ризики для самого бізнесу.
By causing them, the business can have risks which can arise for itself, like investment losses and so on. The guiding principles have launched a lot of processes which have been mentioned today. I do not want to repeat it. The most interesting that what happened in France in 2017, the local legislation in Germany in January 23, this corresponding law will be coming into force about the complex checking of supply chains. In Norway about the transparency. Netherlands have already a law on child labor and on following the risks of child labor. Since September this year, a human rights due diligence is actively being discussed and many other processes happening. One of the most noticeable among them is the discussion on the new European Parliament directive on the due diligence. In February 22, the project of this, a draft of this directive has been published, which now is called Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. It also corresponds to a different directive of the European Union that has been approved by the European Union in November this year about the corporate obligations. Now the details are being still discussed. Some countries logically do not support it, the others do, but we have a lot of hope that there will be enough political will by the EU in order to approve this directive, and it will cover the big European Union companies, and using the principles and governing principles, the big EU companies, the major businesses will follow their supply chains. Another result of this process are the national action plans. Japan is one of the countries that have approved this national plan. You can see the countries that have approved it are marked green. Countries that are marked blue are countries that have declared the desire to approve such national plans. The orange countries are the ones who have initiatives, but that are not official, but on the level of the public. The document of 2020 by the government of Japan, the national plan, also depicts and mirrors the idea, the thought on the need to follow the supply chains and the need to adhere to human rights in the supply chain by Japanese companies. The logical continuation is the recommendation on human rights in the supply chains that has been mentioned today multiple times. And even in this document, Marina Saplikina is going to speak more on it, and I am giving the word to my colleague. Thank you, Olena. Can you hear me? I think I am today in Ukrainian realia. That's why I'll be in semi-darkness. In order to say something different, today is the International Tea Day, and Japan is connected with this notion for me. I like coffee very much, but very often international experts say about the supply chains violations in human rights and so on, and mentioning the company Nestle, who has been in the epicenter of a scandal connected to human rights in supply chains. They have been accused of it, and they have also developed their own policy and rules on how to avoid it. We are going to talk about the recommendation on the human rights in the responsible supply chains in Japan. As mentioned by Olena and by other speakers before me, these recommendations are not binding, but they are important, and more Japanese companies are implementing these recommendations and including them into their own policies. And the companies that want to work on Japanese market do so too, because the recommendations underline that even by what we call individual entrepreneurs, so you're working for yourself as an independent entrepreneur, you also have to adhere to human rights and to respect them independently on your size, on your operational context, on the branch you're working in, on the business and industry. What concerns the supply chains, they're both upstream and downstream, and they also concern business partnership. For example, the security companies with which the company can have some partnerships, including investment and so on. Marina has talked a lot about the international context. I'm going to talk more about the national context in Japan. It is very important to understand that if, for example, a Japanese company works in a different country, or other companies from other countries, they logically need to adhere to national legislation. But if it is softer than the international norms, you should be guided by the international norms. The main idea is that business has to go ahead and to lead in the sphere of human rights, in its operation and its impact. Olena has told about this. I would like to stress on some terms used by the stakeholders. Also, the guidelines and recommendations, they include why they are important. First of all, because it is adherence to the legislation. Olena has told also that for many European countries, they have different legislations. We're approving new legislation and adopting them. Ukraine is harmonizing own legislation system with the European Union, having, as of today, the status of a candidate country. We need to pay attention to this and need to understand that it is important. On Saturday, I had a conversation with representatives of business, and I must say that if a company works for export, it is essential for them to adhere to the human rights, the Jimbark social and governance principles in their activity. And Ukrainian companies working in Ukrainian realia or working in other countries of the European Union or Japan, they say that adherence to the human rights as of today is the future of the business. But they have the same problems that we have today with electricity cuts. They're in the same situation, but they are working. So, because I'm talking about the possibilities and reality of Ukrainian business. The other pro is remedying and reducing the managerial risk that you do not get under boycott of your goods. You have decrease of your investment or loss of interest in investment or breaking of partnership. If a company has its policy in human rights protection, it increases the value of the corporate brand, makes the investment more attractive and the possible partnerships too. Olena has told about the RC, International Corporation, for whom RD, for whom it is important because one of the questions which is interesting for Ukraine, and I want to change it a bit in the topic, there was a very nice discussion on Saturday concerning the human rights, and it is as of today on Facebook. Maybe Olena can send you the link. A discussion on what to be expected for Ukrainian businesses in our modern day context. It is the increasing of the competition ability, of creating reliable supply chains, that are all the advantages mentioned by the Japanese government. And many companies can provide their own cases proving this notion. Concerning the stakeholders, that are the organizations or people who have influence on the company and who are influenced by the company. You can see the exact list here, but especially interesting are the vulnerable groups of stakeholders. If the company evaluates its activity, it has to pay more attention to the adverse impact on the groups that are more vulnerable, like foreigners, women, children, indigenous people, religious and language minorities. That is also actual for Ukraine. What are the main three recommendations? First of all, the company has to have its own adopted policy on human rights, to lead due diligence, human rights due diligence, and to provide access to means of legal protection. That are the three steps the company must do. That are the main three things which are very important. Concerning developing and adopting policies on human rights, that are policies in which companies can exactly formulate their obligations to respect human rights, working with their partners and suppliers, and that management has to have its own obligations, that the company has to evaluate the backdrop and the context they are working in. That is also dialogue with stakeholders, which is very important and crucially valuable. That the policy has to be known and published, not only internally in the organization, but also externally. That it has to be implemented into throughout the business processes. Additionally, recommendation provides two important documents, even though it can be included in different policies, is the code of conduct and the procurement policy. It can be also included into other policies by the companies, in marketing policy, for example, etc. So it has to be implemented in all the departments of the company. Generally, the company has to declare what are human rights for it, which are very important for the company, where the company has the highest influence on. There are a lot of sectoral guidelines. If your company works in one or different sector, you can have a look on your sectoral rules and recommendations. There are a lot of Ukrainian language resources on compliance and on all these documents. And what is also mentioned in all the recommendation, and this is stressed upon, in all the international standards, the attention to stakeholders is crucial. And when talking about stakeholders, we are speaking about the people who know the specificity of the region the company works in. So first and foremost, it is the development of the human rights policy, but the company has to understand which human rights it impacts. Human rights due diligence, if you work very often with the human rights, you will see this abbreviation HRDD. Now you know what it means. So it is the due diligence concerning human rights, but it is actually a sequence of actions used by companies if the suppliers do not
також
understand
можуть
something.
проводити. І також важливо, коли ми говоримо про пріоритизацію, то
Talking about
є декілька
prioritization,
моментів.
there are
Перше,
several
це
aspects which are very
рівень
important.
тяжкості цих
First of all,
цього
is the
негативного впливу.
level
Якщо
of
у нас
the
декілька є,
adverse impact. If
всі
we have
дуже тяжкі, скажімо так, то
some
оцінюємо ймовірність, коли
severe
більше ймовірність,
impact,
і є ще
we need to
варто
assess its probability
всередині компанії і за
and
межами компанії.
we are also speaking about the aspects which are happening inside and outside the company. When we train our employees on the best practices, I'm sure that many Japanese companies will start these trainings and exchange programs for their suppliers. When we talked to Japanese companies in Ukraine, there were several recommendations made by them, even though we were not thinking at that time about it. But I think that the companies will start, the businesses will start communicating about this, comparing it to the context that Japan is working in. The gravity of the human rights impact have also own criteria. So you can see the three criteria, like the scale, scope, and irremediability, how the situation can be remedied, which actions the company can take. There are several of them, but it is very important to understand that the stopping the work with the supplier is the ultimate level. It should not be used, because then the business loses the possibility to have impact on the adherence to human rights by the supplier. And what mechanism can be used? It is like stopping the collaboration for a certain period of time until it is changed. The communication with stakeholders in order to be open. It shall be also communicated with the supplier how they can improve the situation and remedy it. Then the company has the right to impact the situation, to have influence in it, which is important for us. It's not about systemic questions and issues, but the access to education, and where the companies do not influence the high level of poverty, because this is a situation which is related with the government. But it is also mentioned that companies shall engage into creation of parties to remedy this too. For us, several aspects are very important, which are connected to the actions by companies. In conflict times, we call it war times. There is used the term conflict. In these times and periods, the load on employees increases, the risk of sexual and gender-caused violence is increased, and that is why companies have to evaluate with a lot of attention that the human rights of employees of other stakeholders are observed. Also, the possibility to leave the territory of the conflict. And if we talk about the very important company providing essential services or essential goods critically needed, it has to talk about the possibility of leaving the territory, and when needed, it should stay. Also, in conflict times, companies shall use a deepened procedure of due diligence concerning human rights. And here, I want to make a bridge. Elena Mitnick will tell how to learn about this procedure, because the trainings on them are very complicated. It is also to understand the safety of employees and the support provided by the companies is very essential. The recommendation also speaks about the measurement of the efficiency in the context of several stages. That is evaluation of the issues, the prevention of negative impact, the decrease of this impact, and which tools can be used. That are complaints mechanisms, work with stakeholders, interview, questionnaires, audits, measurement of efficiency of internal processes and use of these data for improving the policies, as well as communication and disclosure of data. And the recommendations say that the companies have to change their and to mirror their attitude to the human rights due diligence in their yearly reports. The means of protections are state-related and not state-related. The state-related could be a national contact point that has been created in the Ministry of Economics. On the non-state related are to be located on the site of the company. And the companies have to understand what the main principles can be, what the results when a complaint comes should be provided, like an excuse, a financial or non-financial remedy, which actions should be taken not to have the same cases as before, when it concerns suppliers, how the suppliers can be influenced, and that are the main recommendations for the companies working in Ukraine and working with Japanese companies can do. So I would like to say that for the due diligence and the observance of human rights that needs to take place constantly, it is important to do now and to provide own employees with the needed mechanisms of protection. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, Марино.
Thank you, Marina and Olena, for your presentations, for the problematic that has been mentioned. I would like to remind that the broadcast is available on Facebook. The English version of it is also present on YouTube. And after we finish with this webinar, the registered participants will get a video recording if you didn't manage to join. Then I am coming to the final part of the webinar. As Marina Sapalkina has mentioned, this webinar has an aim to support the supply chains in Japan, and it is logically that during a short webinar we cannot cover all the information and tools on the due diligence, on human rights, integration of human rights into operational activity of companies. And that is why, with the support of the Japanese government, within the United Nations Program on Business and Human Rights, we have initiated an academy on business and human rights for companies, which is being implemented in Ukraine and in other countries of the world, and foresees a consultancy training support for companies, for Japanese companies working in Ukraine and Ukrainian suppliers of Japanese companies, the partners, and just companies working in international markets and in Ukraine, to provide with this support in the framework of the Business and Human Rights Academy. The Academy stipulates 3 important components. First of all, it is based on survey of the human rights risks in the work conditions in Ukraine. Our experts, Olena Uvarova and Marina Sapalkina, have prepared a survey and conducted it in order to learn which potential and real risks are available for companies, how they can be managed, what shall be paid more attention to, and based on this survey, the training program has been developed for the companies in Ukraine. The second component, the trainings, they are available for Ukrainian companies, Japanese companies, their partners and suppliers in Ukraine. And based on the result of the mentioned survey, on the questions and issues that are most pressuring for companies in Ukraine in terms of business and human rights in Ukraine, we foresee 2 training sessions. The first will start on Monday already, and it is for Ukrainian companies working on international markets or having Japanese partners or being suppliers of Japanese businesses. This training program will take place in Ukraine with participation of the best international and national experts in this topic. And the second one is planned for January and February, which is more dedicated, thought for Japanese companies, will take place in Japanese and English in order to cover in complex all the important stakeholders in this process. And as a result of the trainings, all participants who will enroll and who will have a need or desire can receive also individual consultations with experts in the questions they are interested most at. What concerns the Academy on Business and Human Rights, the next session that starts like just in a few days on the 19th, 21st, and 23rd of December, we are going to have 3 online sessions. You can see where to register on the screen using the QR code. Who are these trainings for? Representatives of joint ventures of Japanese-Ukrainian sites, Ukrainian suppliers and partners of Japanese companies, including Ukrainian companies that work on international level, because it can be also interesting for them to develop and to enter new markets. So it can be also interesting for persons who work with the human resources, with the risk management issues, specialists working in equality and inclusion questions, procurement, legal advisors. This happens based on the registration, and as mentioned before, consulting activity and support is also foreseen. For example, if companies need that somebody helps them to elaborate their policies, they can get the opportunity to talk to our experts on that. The session, which is foreseen for the nearest future, will have 3 components. The first will take place on December 19. That will be the business and human rights topic, international aspect of it, which differs a little bit. Recommendation of the USR. The second session is dedicated to the due diligence. That is what Marina talked about, and Olena, and our speaker from Japan. How can the due diligence be used and the procedure? How shall it be done? On which examples? Which practical tasks? And the third module, maybe the most pressuring and most interesting for companies working currently in Ukraine, it's the deepening of the due diligence in the conflict situations, as our experts told already.
Прав людини, вони застосовуються не лише в мирний час, так, але вони стосуються компаній також, які мають посилення.
Concern companies working in the conditions of high risks of the military times, of the conflict times, which we are in now. And this session is dedicated, and the module is dedicated to the cases and modules what should be done, what should be paid attention to, how to start implementing the standards and mechanisms into operational activity. Answers to these questions will be provided in the third module. I leave the QR code on the screen which you can use to get registered. The form is working, that is why you have the opportunity to the end of the week to be registered. We will be accepting new registrations till Sunday. So we invite you to do so because it is a unique program in its art, and the knowledge you are going to get will help you in future to feel more safe and sure in your relations with partners, customers, consumers, and be able to survive your competition. I would like also to tell you that on the backdrop of the deepening the due diligence on human rights in the conflict conditions, there is a nice manual that has been published in summer this year by the National United Nations Commission in the framework of the project supported by the Japanese government. We have been able to translate it into Ukrainian, that it is accessible and understandable for Ukrainian experts and companies, and all those who is interested in this topic. You can use the QR code to find the link and to download this document for yourself to use it for your needs on the main principles of the United Nations on human rights. Having said that, I want to invite you all to join our first module on Monday. If you have questions to our speakers, to us, please write us in the chat. Good afternoon, can you hear me? My name is Andrei, I'm a worker of Sumitomo Corporation. Thank you for this webinar today. It's a very interesting topic. And today in the morning, coincidence, but during today's morning blackout, I have read the book of Viktor Frankl, who described his experience of staying in concentration camp during the World War II, where it was mentioned about such things as that nobody has observed human rights, but it's not about it, it's just like what has been mentioned by one of the speakers, that the adherence to human rights will be an advantage for Ukrainian suppliers. How Ukrainian suppliers can prove documentarily that their company observes human rights, because we understand that we will have to implement these policies in our companies and so on. And while signing the contracts, we may have the demand that the supplier adheres to human rights and it will be part of the contract signing. You do understand that such companies as Kernel, Matinvest, Nibulon, for big companies, they will definitely introduce these policies faster than the others. But there are also suppliers who are small, a small LLC with 5, 10, 20 people who are not very often interested in such questions. And based on this, is there a mechanism a solution mechanism, how a company can prove documentally that it adheres to human rights? If we sign an agreement and learn in the process that the company doesn't have a policy, but we have terms because we need to supply some product. Or shall we just wait until a small company working, like having 5 to 20 employees, and we do not have the time to wait for the company to approve a policy and so on? Thank you. Sorry that it took so much time to formulate.
Дякую дуже, Андрію. Дякую.
Thank you, Андрій.
Олена, Марина, будь ласка.
Я можу почати, а Марина
I can start and Marina will maybe add or say something else. First of all, what you have said, different companies are of different size and they have different resources. There is a definite understanding that the expectations to different companies is also different. Depending on the size of the company and the influence of the company on human rights, let's talk not about risks only, but about the impact too. If we compare the influence of Metinvest and an LSC with 5 employees on human rights, it is very, very different. Logically, that the influence of Metinvest is, and the expectations toward them on human rights is much higher, because their impact on human rights is much bigger. What concerns small companies, you say that when they need to prove somehow and so on, but the concept of human rights develops now in a different way than it was before, when we use the term naming and shaming, when some drawbacks have been discovered, and now it develops in the way of, which could be called as know and show. So big companies, when
відносини, договірні бізнес-відносини з своїми постачальниками, їх задача не в тому, щоб
with their
перевірити,
suppliers, their task is not to check and stop collaborating with the suppliers who don't have their own policies or who have some problems in this connection, or but in order to support these smaller companies in that direction. If you see that your supplier doesn't have a human rights policy and you understand that there are some risks of illegal employment or something else, you, I mean like conditional you, so any big company has as a task to share its own experience. As maybe Marina said, that if a company provides you with very low purchase prices, it should be an indicator, a red flag for you. Maybe you should talk with that supplier why the prices are so low, and is it somehow connected to not observing human rights? And the idea is within that dissolving the partnership or the relations, at least I support this understanding, so that the main task is not just stopping the relations or breaking them down. It should be used only as the last resort, when you see that it will definitely lead to a negative impact, to an adverse impact on human rights. If you can offer tools that will improve your supplier to pay the corresponding salaries, to cover the risks, you should pay this effort, you should make this effort. And another aspect, as of today, why it is important today for Ukrainian business, as of today, Ukrainian businesses have no frames, legal frames. If you do not have the human rights policy, if you do not follow your human rights risks, that you will be fined somehow or you will be punishable. For some European countries, they introduce such punishments for big businesses, which is going to work starting in Germany from next year. For Ukrainian businesses as of today and for Japanese businesses, we have only, like in Japan, there are recommendations, and Ukraine, only the goodwill to implement it. So your reputational risks, your judicial risks or mitigation risks, if it comes to some violation of human rights, your investment risks, but you do not have any sanctions against you by the government. So if you ask me what I shall do when my supplier doesn't have something, you have enough time now to tell your supplier what he has to have, how you can help him in it, because I will repeat it once more, Ukrainian business still have this time to adhere to these new trends which are being formed right now. German businesses do not have this time in the same amount as Ukrainian. Thank you for your broad answer. I'm sorry I interrupted you. The time of blackout is coming, so I can be thrown out of Zoom at any time. I would like to thank you for your answer. If you say like that in other countries like Germany and European countries, there are foreseeable some sanctions for not adhering to the standards of human rights, I do believe that Ukraine is moving alongside the other countries, and maybe a little bit later, after the war, these norms will be implemented on our side too, maybe in a different way, but still, I do understand the principle. So we teach our suppliers how to act and tell them what to do. That is something that we did, like explained to our suppliers about the anti-corruption policy. Thank you very much for your response. May I add?
Дивіться,
Look,
перше, сьогодні глобальні тенденції, вони йдуть до
the global
зменшення
trends
розміру
today,
бізнесу. Тобто, якщо це раніше це
they
були великі
lead
підприємства,
to
то
the
сьогодні
decrease of the size of the enterprises.
європейські компанії є,
European
мають
companies,
почати
as of today,
і, звичайно, компанії Kernel,
are
Astarta і
mainly
так далі, які
middle-sized
ХП, які
businesses. The
знаходяться
companies as MHP,
на
Kernel,
економічних
Nibelon, and so on,
майданчиках, вони мають
they are really
дотримуватися
giants.
і мати такі політики щодо прав людини. Але що сьогодні мають робити наші компанії, які
And
працюють в
what our
Україні,
companies
компанії,
working
які,
in Ukraine should do,
також є великими, як вони можуть робити?
big
Вони можуть
companies,
використовувати
they
той же
could
самий
do it
принцип
in the following way.
пріоритизації.
They
Тому
can
що, звичайно, серед
prioritize,
ваших постачальників у кожної компанії можуть бути
because among your suppliers, every company can have like 10, 20,000 suppliers. And that way the company makes prioritization. You choose your priorities. You will not talk to everyone simultaneously. You will decide first of all. For example, taking the companies you are paying the most money to. It could be a very small LLC, but your dependence on that LLC can be crucial, and the amount of money you're investing or paying to it is very high, and that's why it is among the priority suppliers of yours. So you should choose your priorities, 2 or 3 types of them, and organize trainings, work out some roadmaps, and provide some audit of these companies, because the reputation of your company will depend on the reputation of your priority suppliers, and it will decrease to some small ones.
Дякую вам, так, дякую велике.
Thank you.
Дякую дуже, Андрію. Дякую, колежанки.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Thank you, colleagues, for your responses. Any other questions?
Так, я бачу, що запитань немає.
I see that there are no questions. It means that
Цікава тема нова, і потрібно
topic is
вивчати,
new
аби
and
її
interesting,
розповідати
and some time is
легше
needed
на
in order to
робочому
rethink it,
процесі,
to have a look on own business processes and activities. I would like just to remind that for companies working in Ukraine who are thinking of international markets or who are suppliers or partners of Japanese companies or are planning to become, we propose the United Nations Development Program with the support of the Japanese government, introduced by us. The information can be read from Facebook. I have also shared, I can do it once again, the link for registration, so please join. We will be very happy to see you in these online trainings. To all the participants of today's webinar, I'm very grateful for your time to this topic. Thanks to the speakers for your interesting inside information. The recording of the webinar will be available on Facebook page of the United Nations Development Program and on the YouTube channel of it. And thanks to DIA Business Partnership, we will have the recording also on their portals. So follow the news, and those of you who didn't have the opportunity to join us today will have the opportunity to watch it in recording and find something new. Thank you for your time, for your participation. And we will be pleased to see you in our next events. I wish you a safe continuation of the day and see you.